I've been a preacher for more than 30 years. I've studied and taught through the book of Genesis many, many times in churches all around the world, and I've trained pastors in the skills of interpreting texts. And it's very clear they're not stories about gods. They're stories about the powerful ones in the Bible and the sky people, the Anunnaki, in the Sumerian tablets.
In 1896, eminent scholar Nathaniel Schmidt was fired from his position as Professor of Semitic Languages at Colgate University. For 11 years, this American university had enjoyed Nathaniel Schmidt's erudition in Semitic languages. He delivered numerous courses in Hebrew, Aramaic, Coptic, Arabic, Syriac, and other ancient languages besides. In fact, Nathaniel Schmidt was one of America's leading scholars in the field. So why, after 11 years of outstanding achievement, was he tried for heresy and fired from his tenure in 1896? Though a devout Christian and a Baptist pastor, the authorities considered that his recent theological papers had struck at the very roots of two world religions, Christianity and Judaism.
What Nathaniel Schmidt had done wrong was read the Sumerian and Babylonian and Assyrian texts and notice that they were full of fascinating parallels, stories that occurred there that were uncannily similar to all the stories of beginnings of the Bible. Stories like Adam and Eve, the fall, Cain and Abel, the flood, the limiting of human life, the event at the Tower of Babel. And Schmidt's work demonstrated that the Sumerian accounts and those that followed it from nearly 6,000 years ago were in all probability the source of all those familiar biblical stories. Now, that was a problem in the 1890s, because if you think about it, the church was still reeling from the after effects of Charles Darwin's On the Origin of Species, and it was busy putting together new doctrinal bases and new doctrines of biblical inerrancy to shore up the ship. So the idea that the Bible might actually be based on somebody else's stories was a bit of an embarrassment. It shouldn't have been, because Judaism and Christianity both find their roots in the story of a Sumerian family, the family of Abraham and Sarah. Abraham and Sarah grew up and spent the best part of their lives in Ur of the Chaldees, a Sumerian culture. And so when they emigrated from there, it's hardly surprising that they would carry with them all the stories of beginnings that they had grown up with, and sow them into the foundations of what was to become their culture, their religion, and their Bible. And so it shouldn't be a surprise that in the Bible we have a summary version of all these stories that pepper the Sumerian, Babylonian, and Assyrian texts. The problem and the shock horror is that the original versions, the Sumerian versions of these stories, make no mention of God at all. In the Sumerian originals, these are stories of our ancestors' contact with another species, a species called the Anunnaki.
Could Judaism and Christianity's familiar stories of God really be a retelling of our ancestors' close encounters with extraterrestrials? The cuneiform tablets which had fascinated Nathaniel Schmidt were first unearthed in the 1500s as colonial powers began to excavate the ancient sites of Mesopotamia. Over the decades that followed, some 200,000 clay tablets were uncovered. The tablets were adorned with strange etchings or glyphs made when the clay was soft. Scholars of the day were divided as to the meanings of these markings. Some believed the glyphs to be an unknown written language. Others refused to accept this, since the tablets appeared to predate any known language. They presumed the markings to be no more than decoration. And so the tablets were archived, their secrets locked away for 3 centuries. Until, in 1835, Henry Rawlinson arrived in southwestern Iran.
Rawlinson was a military man. He was employed by the East India Tea Company, and he was in Iran helping the Shah of Iran to train his troops. Now, it's worth pausing there for a moment, because if you thought that corporations rivaling nation states was something new, take a look at the East India Tea Company. A tea company that is able to move a standing army around the world and that trains the armies of nation states, that's quite a tea company. In fact, Rawlinson's presence in Iran wasn't part of a quid pro quo for trading rights. He was there for access to the district of Behistun. He wanted to find the Behistun inscription.
The Behistun inscription was an ancient royal proclamation carved into a cliff face. It was written in 3 known languages: Persian, Elamite, and Akkadian, which was the common language of the Mesopotamian cultures. The inscription expressed all 3 languages in cuneiform script. It was the translation key the cuneiform tablets had been waiting for. The memories of Mesopotamia's ancient cultures were suddenly an open book. The glyphs were not mere decoration after all. They were banking records, business agreements, shopping lists, contracts, recipes, inventories, royal histories, and the most ancient narrative in the history of the world. It was in these ancient narratives that the source of the Bible's familiar stories began to emerge.
At an academic level, Nathaniel Schmidt was in good company. He was one of a small number who began confronting us with this new layer of our history. And I should mention, just to reassure you, that shortly after Colgate University fired him, he did get a new job with Cornell University, and he was professor of Semitic languages there for a full 36 years. So he did land on his feet. His work continued to argue that the cuneiforms reveal that our earliest histories are not about God. They are about our prehistoric contact with the Anunnaki.
In the 20th century, the writer Zecharia Sitchin began poring over the cuneiform texts. He highlighted the clear implications of the Sumerian stories, that the Anunnaki were powerful and advanced extraterrestrial species. Their arrival on planet Earth put them at the top of the terrestrial food chain. To create a local workforce, the Anunnaki used sequences of their own genetic code to hybridize a primate ancestor into a human, ready to put to work for their Anunnaki masters. Sitchin argued the word Anunnaki means those who came from the heavens to Earth, a phrase that made clear their extraterrestrial origin.
Zecharia Sitchin was not an academic. He was not a PhD or a professor. He had a degree from the London School of Economics and worked in commerce. And the LSE, I should say, is a pretty august institution. He wrote at a popular level, that's to say for a general audience, and not with the kind of referencing and footnotes that you'd expect to see in an academic kind of tome. And academic critics don't like that. They think that's slack. Some might identify mistakes or bias in his work, and that's then their pretext to disregard his contribution, which is an important one. Now, some writers in the field reject Sitchin's translation of the word Anunnaki, and they would contend that the word's usage tells us that it simply means nobility or royalty, the rulers. I'm not persuaded by that. It's not that that's not true. It's just a very partial answer. It's a very lazy explanation. It simply doesn't ask enough questions. Who were the rulers identified by this word? Why is that word associated with the rulers? You see, if you look at the etymology of the word, at its root meanings, look at the component parts, you have Anu, which means heavens, Ki, which means earth. Anunnaki are those who came from the heavens to the earth. You can follow the logic. But even if you didn't have that narrative embedded in the word itself, as soon as you read the cuneiforms, the stories themselves unpack that is exactly what was going on. And the glyph that they use to indicate the rulers who come down from the heavens at the beginning of the story, that glyph simply indicates the sky. So these Anunnaki are from the heavens.